Welcome back. And we will proceed by giving each of the speakers a time to comment on or respond to the other speakers' remarks. But I would ask them to please be brief and not to take more than 5 minutes. Then I would like to open it to the public, and they'll have ample time to both respond to the public and make final remarks. So why don't we start with you, Claude? Go ahead.
I can't refrain from starting with a small joke, which is an old Jewish joke about a rabbi who is consulted by a couple, and then he speaks to the lady, and after having spoken to her, he says, "You're right in your conflict with your husband." Then he speaks to the husband and says, "Well, you're right also." Then the aide says to the rabbi, "But Rabbi, you can't say to both of them that they are right." So say, "You're right too." So now, once you heard, this is an old Jewish joke, very famous. So once you heard all of us, you probably might think that we are all right. Well, that's really the problem. That's really the problem. Because there is no right and wrong in this. When we listen to Michael, we hear a lot of things. We cannot say he is wrong. That is his perception. We cannot say he is wrong. Nevertheless, I'd like to say a few words, just really very, very short. First, well, if it sounds demagogical, well, it is. So, first, I think Michael will agree with us. We have one great thing here, which is freedom of expression. This is a great thing in this terrible situation, which is terrible for all of us, for him, for us, for everybody. Well, he can speak really freely. I'm happy, and we will struggle for that freedom, for his freedom of expression. Who is we? Well, all the law professors, including you. But now that you ask so nicely, let me tell about the experience I had, and you related a little bit to it, when I was for some time a consultant at that committee yesterday. Aaron Barak spoke about it. It was a committee at the Knesset for the Constitution, the law, and the law. And this is a very, very busy, well, it was a very busy, it's a committee. It's like, we had a course at the law school called the Israeli-Arab conflict, so it's very easy. You will have this course for another 50 years. Now, this committee preparing the Constitution has been busy for 50 years, 60 years. It's going on and on. And when I paid attention to the fact that at this committee, when I participated for a long time, well, the Arab members, MKs, hardly showed up, practically never talked, even when at one time there was an idea which might have been a bad idea or a good idea, I don't know. Among the basic laws yesterday, Aaron Bach talked about the fact that we have basic laws. One of the basic laws which was presented was called a basic law, the Arab minority in Israel and its status and rights and duties. Well, at first glance, I looked at the Arab members. Sometimes they just come, they open the doors, they look, what are we talking about, and then they leave. And they didn't know how to handle the case. Well, they really didn't know, because it was clear that a basic law for the Arab minority would define them as a minority. Well, it's not easy. I'll come back to that just for a second. It would have recognized them some rights, real rights, very clearly, not only rights through the court. It's good to have the Supreme Court of Israel. It's very good, but it's not really, everything out of the court, and then you criticize the court for being hyperactive. That's a real problem. And they didn't know really how to handle the case. Were they in favor or against it? They abstained. They showed no interest at all. Well, since there were also some Jewish opponents, MKs who opposed such a basic law, the idea disappeared very quickly. But it was a pity. And I think I reflected I thought about it, and I came to the conclusion, as you said, Michael, now, a constitution begins by the word we. We. And if you have a basic law, so you accept the basic law, there is a we you have to enter in. As long as you don't enter this we, so you are out of the society. Now what you say, Michael, said, well, we don't offer. I mean, this Israeli society doesn't offer you this sphere, public. Well, it goes both ways, I think, and I will be like the rabbi, okay? It goes really both ways. Like a famous sentence would say, a minority is a minority is a minority. Nothing to do about it. It's a minority. The Arabs in Israel are a minority. It's not easy to be a minority. Before I came to Israel, I was a member of a religious minority. Yes. Okay. I'm even ready to say the following sentence. You may quote me. I would not like to be an Arab in Israel. It's not easy. It's not easy. I wouldn't like to be a Jew in an Arab country, you know, maybe even less. But that's another question. It's a little bit demagogic. But it's not easy to be an Arab in Israel. But that's the situation you have to cope with. Now, we have to offer. We have not done enough. I recognize that. But I have the impression that there is an extraordinary resistance to everything, even a small thing which can be offered. Like, for instance, I just say civil service or things like that instead of military service. Of course, you will not, in this country where military service is very heavy, as you know, of course Arabs are not going into the army. But why not the civil service? In the service of the Arab population. I mean, there's no real explanation for that. Just that it's the state of Israel who offers it, who organizes, and we cannot accept it. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
There's a kind of an illusion in our discussion, I must admit, because it categorizes each of us in a certain category. I'm an Arab, both of my interlocutors are Jews, and this kind of presupposes that this is our life here. And this is the illusion which is an illusion. I'm not Arab 24 hours a day. At the university, I teach in Hebrew. Now I'm lecturing in English. At home, I'd like to listen to a certain kind of music. I read Hebrew literature. I'm all kinds of things during the day. I'm not just an Arab. And my individual characteristic as a human being would have much in common, I think, with Claude and Ruth. This we do have in common as individuals, as human beings. But when I was speaking about the public sphere, I'm speaking about a public sphere that I can relate to when I'm an Arab. Not 24 hours a day, but one day in the year. We don't have 1 year, 1 day in the calendar, in the official state calendar, that Arabs and Jews share. Not one single day. This is what I'm speaking about. And don't be eluded by the fact that we do share a lot of things, and I do share a lot of things. If I would argue in court, we have norms that are just, that are true, that are convincing, which I do share, and I concede. And I spoke much about the other side. I can speak also about my side. I think the Arab population inside of Israel and the Palestinian collective entity as such has done a very poor job in terms of also relating not to the world, not to its national narrative, but to the sensitivity to the self of the Jewish collectivity. And not many people in my community do understand the kind of worries that a Jewish individual in the state of Israel has. And I've done a lot of research on this subject. I can share with you one research project that I dealt with. It has to do with religious matching in adoption. In Israel, we have a very strict norm. Section 5 of the adoption law says that there cannot be an adoption unless there is a complete matching between the adopter and the adoptee and the child. This has to be in Israel. And when I looked into the past, when I looked into the Knesset deliberations, the group that was very much insisting on this condition was Jewish religious parties. Now, if you look at matching requirements all over the world, especially in the United States, racial matching, whites and blacks especially, the requirement, the argument for the matching was on part of the minority, not on part of the majority. It was the black community that was demanding for the matching. In Israel, it was the other way around. It was the Jewish community that argued for the matching. And the Arab minority was also very much silent, was not even present, did not insist. And I think in the long run, the matching requirement served more the Arab community than the Jewish majority, because when there is no such restriction, children move from the economically weaker group to the more privileged group. And I ask myself, why is this so? And I came to the conclusion, which I do concede, that part of it is to understand that the Jewish community inside of Israel, even though it's a majority vis-a-vis myself, it's not thinking as a majority. It is, in some spheres, still thinking as a minority. So you don't want to be a minority, but I think you do think, Claude, still as a minority. And part of the problem here inside of Israel in the relation is that you have two minorities clashing, each perceiving itself differently from how the other side is perceiving itself. And I think my community can do a much better job in looking into the fears, justified or not, but true nonetheless, of the Jewish side. And speaking to that fear, relieving that fear. And this is something that I do concede. In terms of the freedom of expression, of course, I admit there is a freedom of expression, but I don't perceive it that this is something that the state has done because of its goodwill. I think it belongs to me as a human being. If the state recognizes it, then so be it. Civil service, this is an issue that has been raised by my two colleagues, and I think it's a very important debate. The Arab community is arguing at least two arguments. Look at the Bedouins and the Druze inside of Israel. They not only do civil service, but some of these communities do actual military service, at least the Druze male individuals, and some of portions of the Bedouin communities, more in the north, less in the south. And look at their status. Are they better off? Or are they just the same as the rest of the non-Jewish population? And I think if you check any survey, you would find that they're not better off. For a considerable period of time, I think the Druze community has done even poor, or less well than the non-serving Arab community. So why should I do a service when I know beforehand that it's not going to work out? At least I can prove it. And the other thing is about the argument is that if I would do equal duties, I would get equal rights. That's also an illusion. I would not get equal rights. My rights would be still less. Now, you heard arguments about individual and collective rights. In certain spheres, with all due respect, you cannot differentiate between individual rights and collective rights. I, as an individual, to live my language, personally, individually, I would need the protection on the basis of the group. This is the liberal multicultural argument. You cannot differentiate. Read Will Kemnicka's work. I, as an individual with an autonomy, cannot live my individuality without having the collectivity. I cannot live my tradition, I cannot live my culture as an individual without having the protection of the collectivity. And if we accept this, you're asking me to give equal obligations, but when it comes to the collective rights, you're not going to be equal. This is what we just heard. So if I'm not going to be equal in collective terms, totally equal, well, just give me some way where I can also be less equal in terms of obligations. If this equation is the proper equation, if I cannot have equal rights, if I cannot marry, if I cannot be united with my family member, with my spouse if she happens to live in the West Bank, this is law. I cannot be united here. And as an Israeli, I cannot go and live there because with an Israeli passport, that's illegal. If this cannot be given, then why should I, if I would not have equal rights, why should I have equal obligations? Thank you.
Thank you. Ruth?
Initially, I thought I'll pass, but I want to say 4 very short things. A, minority-majority. I think it's correct that Jews are, in some sense, behaving as a minority. I think they're afraid. I think they feel very vulnerable. I think there are 2 very important explanations for this fact. One is history. The lot of Jews in the past has not been very marvelous. But the other is more important because it's not about the past, but it's about the present and the future. In Israel, pre-67 Israel, Jews are a stable majority. But in the region, Jews are a minute minority. Israel is a developed, affluent country with huge land borders with countries that are third world countries. I don't have to tell the people sitting here about the issues of immigration in our world, but you can think that this is not a very stable situation where this arrangement exists. Now, we now have a conflict, but the conflict hopefully is temporary. Let's assume that we don't have a conflict. Can you imagine the problems that will have to be faced by the State of Israel if the borders are supposed to be open with the differential, social economic differential and the democratic differential between Israel and its surroundings that is many times larger than that between the United States and Mexico? Not to speak about the Spanish enclaves in Africa. So that's minority and majority. Rights on 2 issues. A, does the equal citizenship and equal sense of citizenship relate to the question of do you have equal rights? I think this is a wrong way of looking at the question. I think this is one of the problems with the general human rights discourse, that it's disconnected between the rights, the claims, the entitlements, and the nature of societies. Societies are built on a relationship between members of that society and their institutions. We heard about the difference between Republican citizenship and liberal citizenship. Republican is only Jewish, Arab is only liberal, and I agree that this is not a good situation. Now, we need to make the Arabs feel more responsible to their state. And yes, there are problems. There are problems also for many Jewish groups that are not equal, and they are discriminated against, and all kinds of things. But if you have a sense, as Claude said, of a we, that we are committed together to the strength, flourishing, progress, and democracy of our state, then it's a different situation. But then you don't ask in any particular situation, is my situation better if I do this? You are a citizen, and you struggle together. Now, it's not true, I think, and this is another thing, the complexity of the situation, that the Druze are not, the Druze who serve are in the same situation. The Arab community in Israel is not homogeneous. The Christian community in Israel, in all terms of size of family, social and economic progress, level of education, and mobility, is in a much better shape than the Jewish community of Israel. But it's a minority within the Arab community. The Druze community in Israel is in a better situation than many of the other Muslim communities, but it's true that is not in a better situation than the very privileged Christian communities. I think it's going to be very misleading. Adoption. When the British mandatory authorities came into Israel, they had the millet system on marriage and divorce, the orthodox monopoly over marriage and divorce. The British asked the Jews and the Arabs, what do you want to do on marriage? The Jews said, let's go civil. Let's do civil marriage. The Arabs said, no, we want the millet system. And it's for the very same reason that we have a coalition of the Orthodox Jews and the Arabs. And the reason is that they indeed feel minorities, and for them, their communal cohesion is much more important than civic integration. And yes, that's part of the complexity of the picture here. And there is an interesting alliance between the Jewish Orthodox and the non-Jews, because they're both, in a way, minorities. And one final thing about identities as individuals and as collectives. Of course, when you are a member of a minority or a member of a persecuted group, the welfare of the group is responsible in part to your welfare as an individual. But we know that this is not simply the case, and we know that the relationship between collective rights and individual rights has been a major issue within the human rights history and discourse. And after the First World War, we wanted to talk more about collective rights. We were very scared about that because of what had happened. And in the post-Second World War, there was a very, very strong effort to minimize collective rights because they were seen as dangerous. Then collective rights came back. Now we see this is not only about Israel. You can see this dilemma in the breakup of Yugoslavia in a very powerful way. People who were friends and neighbors and lived together as citizens of Yugoslavia all of a sudden became enemies because of the revival of the ethnic feelings. This is something, very interesting. Many people said that we are in a post-national society. Many people think, no, nationalism is coming back with great force. You look at the world around you, it's really unclear. The nation state clearly is not obsolete. Many countries voluntarily create themselves as nation states, ethnic nation states. Nationalism, ethnicism, languages, cultures, traditions are very important forces. Within Israel, I think I want to go back to the constitution because this is fascinating. One of the important cases about Arab rights in Israel is Ka'adan. Ka'adan is a case in which an Arab family wanted to go and settle in a Jewish settlement. The Jews didn't want the Arabs to move in, and the court said, you can't do this. Maybe the minority can do that, but you, the majority, cannot do that. Now, the court used individual rights. One of the important Arab civil society organizations refused to represent that Arab family because they said, this is weakening us. You, an affluent Arab family, you are going to assimilate into Israeli Jewish society. We don't want to allow you to do that. We are going to try and struggle for more Arab villages. Now this has changed because the same organization is now representing Arab families who want to go and live in Jewish families because they realized that there is a potential here of doing something very interesting that every country with this kind of problem knows. You create a movement into a white settlement, a white town. There is a tipping point, and then there is a flight of the whites and a re-identification of this. And now the struggle of some of the Arab leaders is for that, is to gain through the individual rights of non-discrimination entrance into Jewish settlements, make a critical mass move into that settlement, make the Jews then leave because they wanted to live in a not binational or Arab settlement, and create more Arab settlements in this way. That this is legitimate, this is using the system, this is all fine, but we should understand that the struggle of individuals and communities is interwoven in ways that I agree with Michael. We are forced to be more of members of the collective than is good for us as individuals, and maybe than is good for us as groups. Because if we had an open avenue of becoming just individuals or less clearly Arabs or Jews, maybe this would have meant a better future for Israel. It's not clear that this is in the cards as long as the conflict is unresolved and the rhetorics and the radicalization of the leadership is so pronounced.
Thank you. And now the time has come to hear from the audience. And I will be taking, the first person is Don Oliver, then I see Martin Shannon. Okay, go ahead, Don. First one.
Right, well, thank you very much. And I feel privileged to be able to listen to this fascinating and actually rather depressing discussion this morning. And it's come home to me very much how the position is obviously not just about democracy being about structures and procedures and so on. Democracy is also, or at least the way in which a democracy does or doesn't work is also very much to do with the psychology of the population and the psychology of elected representatives, government, public servants, and so on. And I've been working recently on some of the literature in the fields of human nature, anthropology, evolutionary psychology, economics, tit-for-tat theory, and so on. And I think one can get a lot of really interesting insights, perhaps not solutions, but insights into how politics, how democracies and so on work from those sciences. And I've actually been working on trying to formulate some ideas about what lies at the bottom of the workability of many Western democracies, including my own. And we tend to think of ourselves as liberal democracies. And I think a distinction is to be made between liberal democracies on the one hand and other kinds of democracy. And it may be that Israel is a democracy, but not perhaps a liberal democracy in the sense in which I'm going to explain it. I was very struck by the point that Michael Cariani made that the, as far as he or Arab, the Arab population can see it, the government does not operate in order to govern in the interests of all of the population. And it seems to me that it is essential, if a democracy is going to work as a democracy, as a liberal democracy, that those in power should consider that the whole of the population is, amongst other things, one group. It may also be split up into Christians, nutters, all sorts, but anyway, one group with sufficient common interests for it to be realistic for them to govern in the interests of that whole group, and for the population to trust them enough to accept that that's the case. Okay, and democratic structures are largely about putting pressure on governments to do that. You can't just assume that because people have voted, the government that comes out of the election is going to govern in the interests of the whole state. They might be very tempted to govern in the interests of their own supporters. But so I call that the public interest principle, if you like. And then there's a related principle, which is the public service principle, which is the principle that public servants, ministers, and so on should be governing or exercising their powers altruistically. And by that I mean, and I take the term altruism from the evolutionary psychology and anthropological literature, not in order to promote the interests of their own race, class, trade union, you name it, but that they should recognize and they should be expected to govern, to exercise their powers in the general public service. And the mechanisms that are very effective, but not obviously foolproof in promoting that, are not just the democratic mechanisms of elections and ministerial responsibility and so on. It's the public response when those principles are not fulfilled. And we saw that very strongly over the last summer in the United Kingdom, when suddenly it was revealed to all of us that many of our MPs, as you I'm sure all know, had been claiming expenses they weren't entitled to, or spending or claiming money for extravagances. Now, it wasn't against the law. Well, fraudulently claiming money is, but being very extravagant is not. But we suddenly realized there's a very strong social norm which found itself expressed in the press and everything, that the public service principle and the public interest principle are what the population expect of their governors. Now, I mustn't be horrible about Italy, which I love, but I suspect that if it had been found that MPs in Italy and maybe other countries had been fiddling their expenses, people said, oh, well, you know, I mean, we all do that. What's funny about it? Anyway, we were furious. Now, my point is that if it is not believed by the population that the government and so on are promoting the general public interest and treating the whole community as having sufficient common interest for that to be possible, you will then get from the people who feel that they're being left out a withdrawal of any kind of cooperation, refusal to reciprocate when things are required of them, of course a lack of trust, and that will generate a lack of trust in return. You will get tit-for-tat games. Our politicians play tit-for-tat all the time. If you aren't going to cooperate with us, why shouldn't we cooperate with you? Eventually you may get violent conflict. Now, looking again at the sort of human psychology evidence on this, what mechanisms, what psychologies do humans have to deal with that? Well, it's a huge literature. I can't go into it. But one way of avoiding conflict, which we have, cows don't, we have, is the ability to negotiate, to trade. So, and I see this happening, if you just want me to, if I'd like to bring it home, this has been part of the problem in Northern Ireland. There's not been, we have had some problems in Northern Ireland. They could flare up again any time, which are not a million miles from some of the problems here. And part of the solution, and I don't want to be simplistic, the problem is that the Republicans consider themselves to be Irish, not British, and the Unionists consider themselves to be British. And so you have two inconsistent identities. What has been part of the solution has been institutionalized power sharing. So after an election, we have statutory rules about the sharing out of cabinet posts and a procedure for achieving that. Now, I'm not suggesting that would be a solution here, far be it from me to suggest that sort of thing. But I do think that what we can get out of this psychological approach is very useful. Thank you
very much. Martin?
Thank you. The panel was fascinating, but I cannot resist asking the obvious question. What's the link to our yesterday's discussion? If the current generation in Israel, by a large majority, decides our state is a Jewish state, that's one thing. But the question is, should it bind future generations? Should it be legislated? Should it be a constitutional norm? Should it be an eternal constitutional norm, not subject to change? This is my question, and I hope the panel will address it to educate us. Secondly, I just wanted to draw a parallel to a country in my own region, namely Latvia, which has the experience of Stalinist population transfers, persecution of the nationalists, bringing in Russians, to a large extent military personnel and their families, to the effect that almost half of the population was Russian at time of independence, and all major cities had a Russian majority. In this situation, the Latvian population felt like a minority in their own country, and the answer was the state is to protect Latvian language and culture against the threat. And this has resulted in very problematic laws and practices, which we Nordics have been criticizing and trying to persuade the Latvians to amend the situation, to remove many of the restrictions upon their Russian-speaking population. But it has resulted in absurd legal constructions, so that Latvia has not only citizens, foreigners, meaning nationals of other countries, and stateless persons, but a fourth category of non-citizens. So it's a category of persons who are not foreigners in Latvia, who are not really stateless because their effective link is to Latvia, but who are not recognized as citizens because of having the Russian background. And again, I would say these situations do not deserve constitutional entrenchment or even legislative entrenchment. We should try to convince to do away with the legal categorizations behind, even if the identity of the constitutional subject would remain Latvian. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Unlike my English colleague, I must admit that I did not find this discussion depressing at all. Quite on the contrary, the speakers were speaking very much with each other and not talking or even shouting at each other, and I find that remarkable and comforting. I have a few quick remarks and one question. My question stems from a certain confusion that I've had for years. When I have talked to Jews outside Israel, like in the United States or in Germany, to them Jewishness was a religion. They were Jews like I used to be Catholic. Here, the subtext is Jewishness is a nation. Now, first, what is it? And second, is that a debate that is being held? My second remark is just a very quick reaction to what Michael Cariani said. Something interesting from a comparative point of view, how values can be different. The racial matching in adoption that I had only heard of before from the United States would be considered in Germany so absolutely abhorrent a thought that nobody would dare even mention it, ever. And my main remark is on your main topic, the Jewish state. I don't think, as I think Professor Gavian said, the problem or the conflict is Jewish state and democracy. It seems to me more that the conflict is Jewish state and equality. And I have the impression, I might be wrong, that the notion of inequality is automatically and undeniably implicit in the very notion of a Jewish state, because if you're not Jewish, you're not part of it. And the Jewish state must put Jewish values above everything else. Otherwise, Jewishness of the state doesn't make any sense to me and could be stricken out. So either you have a Jewish state with inequality, or you have equality but no Jewish state. I understand the historical reasons, of course. I'm not evaluating that. I'm just trying to analyze it. Now, an additional problem seems to be that the Arab minority is not an immigrant, but an original minority. I personally believe, that's highly contested, that immigrants can be expected to adapt. But the minority here has been here forever, cannot really be expected to adapt to Jewish ways. So calling Israel a Jewish state might be somewhat like Belgium calling itself a Flemish state. Difference being the history, and I'm aware of that. And there seems to me to be a third level of problem in this inequality. That is that Jewish, if I understand correctly in the Israeli sense, is not a fluent, undefined concept like German or French or English. You ask German people, they have ancestors from everywhere. It's very mixed. If I understand correctly, you cannot become a Jew here. If I understand correctly, it's the Orthodox view. I could not tomorrow say I want to be Jewish, and then I would be Jewish and join Israel. That's what I was told. Please correct me.
You can say as much as you like.
But
It's very hard, but you can.
okay, I was just told that the Orthodox view, maybe somebody can just explain that to us. The Orthodox view is the official Israeli view. So even this theoretical possibility of merger doesn't exist. And please explain that, since I would love to hear more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's at least another conference. The next speaker I have is Rainer Arnold.
Yes, I very much impressed by all these reports and comments, and I would like only maybe three short points. First, you differentiate between individual and collective rights. Well, the Human Rights Covenants, Article 27, for example, is more based now on an individual rights-oriented basis, and while we have also in, the framework convention of the Council of Europe, and also the minority language treaty, and all this is more giving collective rights. So my first question in this context is, how are your fundamental rights, internal fundamental rights, conceived as very individual rights? Do you have individual minority rights, or do you recognize that also, even if you conceive them at individual rights, they have a collective dimension somehow? This is my first question. What would you, because Michael did say that you see one of the models is maybe to strengthen individual rights, and always connected to equality, of course. This is a very basis. Well, the second one is the notion of democracy, because, democracy, is it connected to rule of law and to fundamental rights? Because I speak of the German rule of law concept, which is now value-oriented and based on fundamental rights. Maybe it could be that we separate more democracy and rule of law, and both can be conflicting, of course, because majority rule, seeing democracy as majority rule, is not even corresponding to recognizable values, not always, but so there must be a complementary relationship between democracy, rule of law, and fundamental rights. And the third point is only, you mentioned, Claude, in your historical introduction, that a militant democracy is, of course, also seen here as an important concept, and that political parties have been excluded or prohibited, and that we have in Germany this Article 21, which of course has more, more abhorrent or let's say defensive character, but in the sense that we did not use it very much. So we have 3 cases. The third case, unfortunately, did not go on. And the other is we prefer a political solution. We have this 5% clause for political parties to get into parliament. And so, extreme parties normally were excluded on a political way, so we had now not to defend ourselves so much by this formal prohibition of political parties by the Federal Constitutional Court. And I would like to know a bit about how is it in Israel today. Thank you.
Thank you. Susie Nava.
Thank you. I would like to link the discussion this morning to the discussion yesterday, following Martin's question and also Arnold's remark. Maybe take one of the subjects that has been mentioned by Claude and Ruth and take it to to a development that may happen in Israel, to something that may be considered by maybe most of you an unconstitutional constitutional amendment. And that is the possibility of disqualification of political parties. Now, you all heard that we may and we have the possibility to ban a party that is inconsistent with democratic values and with the Jewish and democratic state. This is not an idea that we invented. We just picked it up from the Grundgesetznorm. It was all there, and it suited very much what Israel wanted to do in 1985, meaning that we wanted to ban a racist party, and we wanted to arrange in the basic law, meaning in our constitution, the case of Elad. So it was there, and it was very easy to pass such a law. But what you haven't heard yet is that since then, we have amended this law twice in order to allow for more disqualification of Arab parties, meaning that we have amended our constitution in order to try to ban the Arab parties. And we have done so when in October 2000, for example, when some of the Arab participants in the Knesset, some of our Arab members of the parliament tried to speak against, well, let's say support some terrorist acts. So the Knesset said, okay, we disqualify those who do not accept the Jewish state. Let's disqualify also those who support terrorists. So the law was passed again, and this amendment was against. It was an ad casum amendment meant to deal with exactly this kind of Arab members of the Knesset. Of course, we're not the only ones to deal with that, and in the same year, okay, a law was passed also in Spain in order to allow for the qualification of parties that support terrorism. But then our Arab members tried, and well, you know, they went abroad. They took a plane and went to Syria or to Lebanon. So the Knesset said, okay, we're going to disqualify, to try and ban political parties whose members they fly to enemy countries. Okay, it's of course it's amended as a general article, and it's an amendment to the Constitution, but the reason and the cause is very simple and is there. So let's take it a little bit further. Just imagine, and I'm not dealing with the question that Martin asked the panel, meaning stating Israel is a Jewish country. Would it be an unconstitutional and constitutional amendment? But you have seen already 4 amendments that they are all meaning to deal with one sector in the Knesset, meaning we do not want these, what they call radical Arab parties in the Knesset. What will be the next one? The next case may be, let's say, that only Zionist and Jewish parties would be allowed. And the question is, I don't know, maybe Professor Claude would say something about it. Would it be considered an unconstitutional constitutional amendment? Well, in Israel, no parties have been banned, not because of the legislator, but only because the Supreme Court was there and was ready to interpret, as you heard Professor Barak, okay, these amendments very restrictively. For example, not the way that the Constitutional Court in Spain, okay, interpreted the same amendment. The Constitutional Court in Spain took the Harry Batasuna party out of Parliament because this is what Parliament wanted. But the Israeli Supreme Court did not do that. So imagine that we did not have this court, or strong court saying, okay, this is an amendment you did, but we do not want to apply it. Okay, would it be unconstitutional in Israel? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from the floor? Yes, Ulrich Price.
Well, I have one remark and one question. The remark is a conceptual remark, especially to what Claude said at the very beginning. Conceptually, I think we should distinguish between a nation state and a state defining itself as comprising nationality. So the nation, I think this is what Ruth said, I think la communauté des citoyens. The nation is the community of citizens. So it is defined in political terms. And that means that the claim for identity and for identifying is much, much lower than in a state of, if the nation state is in truth, not a nation state, but a nationality state. Normally, we don't have a nationality state because if there's only one nationality in one state, which is an anomaly in historical terms and also in conceptual terms, I guess, normally we have, when we speak about nationality, in the plural. So we have binational, or better, of course, multinational. Whenever there's bi, only two, just the same is true for federalism, there's the conflict are especially unsolvable, at least difficult to solve. So I don't speak about that. I just mean that conceptually speaking, we should think that the starting point of a state in political terms is a nation state in terms of being composed of citizens. Now, the special problem why now Israel kind of has this ambiguous character. At the one hand, it's a la communauté des citoyens, so a citizenship, also for Arab, of course, for the Arab part of the nation of the population. On the other hand, it's defined as Jewish, and I understand, and that was really enlightening for me. I understand that as a reaction of the Jewish Israelis to the decision of the Arabs not to accept a distinct state for themselves. So that in 1947, so declining to accept the UN resolution. So that I think is the situation which creates this ambiguous situation, and that leads me to my question. In Europe, when we speak about minorities, we have always the problem that there is one internal minority which has neighbors in a state where this minority is the majority. So the Hungarians in Slovakia, or speak of the 30s and 40s of the previous century, the Germans in Czechoslovakia, this caused the problem. And I wonder whether, and that's the question, whether the problem that the Arabs are unwilling to accept the Jewishness of the state, or that the Jews insist on the Jewishness of the state and cannot transfer, so to speak, the state into the nation state of the Communauté des Citoyens, because the Arabs in Israel might feel that they betray the claim of the Palestinians outside Israel for a distinct statehood. Once the state, the Palestinian state, would be established, could that, and that's the question, could that ease and facilitate the situation of the Israeli Arabs to accept their status of citizens of Israel, and also of kind of accepting the character as a state, as of a state, as and of the Jewish as well, of the Jewish party as well, as a state, as a community of citizens. So that's the question: whether this outside pressure may create the inside problems of Israel, and that this could be eased once the Palestinian state has been established. Thank you.
Thank you. There's still room for a couple questions, comments, if anybody feels like going once. Okay, so why don't we let the panelists give concluding remarks. I guess we'll start in reverse and ask Ruth to go first.
Well, there were many very interesting and difficult questions raised. I'll try quickly. Can it be that Israel is a democracy but not a liberal state? Possibly. There are also other questions having to do with the notion of democracy. Part of the problem that we have here is that all the concepts we are using are very, very deeply contested. So we can start with just stipulative definitions, and it's not very helpful. I think that there are two senses at least that are relevant here of liberal, or three maybe. One is liberal is neutral. Second is liberal is committed to the protection of human rights. And third is liberal in the sense of liberal versus conservative in the social economic sense. I think actually Israel is liberal in the latter two. Israel, as I said, does not aspire to be a neutral state. To the extent that liberalism is the protection of human rights, there is a debate whether human rights is a part of democracy. I don't want to go into this debate, but I think Israel is and should be committed to human rights, and maybe the record is not perfect, but that's not something that is a part of the principle of its establishment. I am very moved, and I totally agree that a good state is a state which is motivated and inspired by a principle of the public interest and the public service. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that most people are now living in societies that do not meet these two principles to a sufficient degree. Israel is definitely in that group, not because of the Jewish-Arab problem, but because of corruption and self-interest and all that kind of issues. Anyway, should all of this be constitutionalized? And if constitutionalized, should it be non-amendable, or should it seek to be non-amendable? I made a few comments about that in my speech. I said that I'm very sorry it's now officially constitutionalized. I think that it shouldn't have been. I think it shouldn't have been because I believe that constitutions cannot change political realities. They can structure them, they can use them, they can help in an ambiguous situation, but if there is a bad situation, they cannot do the work. That's why I think that those who speak about Israel as one of Israel's main problems is not having a constitution don't really understand the nature of the problem. We don't have a constitution because of the problems. A constitution wouldn't have solved the problem. So I don't think it should have been in the constitution. And if it is in the Constitution, I clearly don't think that it should not be amendable. I think this is crazy. On the other hand, because I feel that the justification for the Jewishness of the state is not merely the majority, but self-determination. This is the underlying justification of the whole idea. Since this is the underlying justification, I think it's legitimate that the Jewish majority will seek ways to strengthen and entrench, not constitutionally, but educationally and in a public spirit sense, its different identity. So then I have to come back to the real question, is it justified? Is it justified after all? So I said I cannot go into it. I cannot go into that. I mean, there are a lot of works dealing with this question. And I think the answer is yes. It is justified for Israel to be a state that is special in the sense that has special affinity to the Jewish people. Now, some people say, okay, maybe that's not a problem with democracy, because democracy may be in part majority vote, it's majority vote, but it's still a problem because democracy is committed to equality. But now we have to see what kind of equality is democracy committed to. Democracy is not necessarily committed to equality in a social economic sense. Democracy is also not necessarily committed to the fact that the society will be homogeneous. Democracy is not committed to equality in the sense that all the residents of the place will be citizens. Democracy is not committed to many sorts of equality. There is one sense of equality that is critical, and this is one person, one vote. This principle is very important. It seems like nothing. We take it for granted. It's important. It's critical. It exists. Equality is also important in one of the senses of the principle of public interest. You must work for the benefits of all your society. And yes, democracy means, and not only democracy, a state means that the community of the state, in one sense at least, is the community of all the citizens. And in this sense, all states are particularistic. You're French, it means that you're not English. And you are English, it means that you're not German. And even in the EU, there are elements of difference that stems from the fact that each state defines a community that is distinct. It's distinct in terms of nationality, but it's also distinct in terms of culture, like language. Usually language is, and language is not necessarily ethnic origin. You may have the same language with people of different origin or religion. Now, I cannot go into the question of Judaism as a religion. It's so complicated. The Jewish people is the only collective in the world which is defined by both religion and community. There are many people from many nations. Palestinians can be Christians and Muslims. Yes? And Arabs can be Muslims and Christians. And Muslims can be Iranians and Arab. So you have Christians all over the place. Jews, it's a one-to-one. If you are, some people think, you cannot be a person who belongs to the Jewish people if you don't have some kind of connection to the Jewish religion. Now, this is a huge internal debate within the Jewish people and the Jewish tradition. I cannot go into it. And it's very complicated. How can you become a Jew? Can you become a Jew? Can you become a Jew without being converted? Is it only Orthodox? But if you can only become a Jew by conversion, that means that Judaism is indeed a religion. So where is the Jewish people coming from? But the Jewish religion thinks that the Jews are not only a religion, they're not only a community of faith, but also a people. Now, the only one thing I want to get out of this is the clarification that is very important, that for Zionism and for the international community and for the struggle on Israel, Jews are a people. The religious case Jewish school in Britain is, I think, fascinating, not going to that. But for Jews who decide that they want to live in other countries, it's almost imperative that Judaism is mostly a religion. Because in order to enable them to feel full solidarity with the nations that are hosting them, they need to downplay the non-religious element of Judaism. Now, this is part of Jewish emancipation and the history, be a Jew in your home and be French outside, to Jews everything, to Judaism nothing. This is all part of a long history, again, not only applying to the Jews. But one of the things about Israel is that when you want to become a member of the new project of self-determination in Israel, your sense of your Jewish identity is not necessarily exhausted by Judaism. And in fact, still a majority, may be declining, still a majority of Jews within this country and a majority of Jews in the world are people who define themselves as Jews and want to be Jewish, but do not observe and do not consider themselves religious. And huge literature. We can't do this, I think, now. What is the connection? What is our conception of rights? I think we have a conception of rights that is very sensitive to both individual and group rights, and I think both Jews and Arabs in Israel enjoy both group rights. Language, the millet system, education system in their language, municipal governance to a large extent that is Arab and respectively religious. All of these things exist in Israel and are both collective and respecting of the collectivity of them. One last point about banning of parties and the fact whether those amendments in the Israeli legal system may be seen as unconstitutional amendments. My answer is no. They cannot. I think the category is misapplied, and this opens a whole debate. I don't know how much of it you did yesterday about Israel's constitution. I mean, I understand that now you already assume that there is a constitution, and now we're talking about whether it's amendable and how is it amendable, and is it possible to say that some constitutional amendments are. Since in Israel, it's still debated whether you have a constitution. And still in Israel, we still have a debate on how to amend the constitution, because most of the constitution is not entrenched, so you amend it by a regular law, and possibly you can amend it by a judicial notwithstanding clause. It's a total mess, as any comparative constitutional theorists will tell you. So I want to say to the examples that Susie gave that A, they're not necessarily constitutional amendments. They are are statutory amendments. And B, I don't think that they are unconstitutional even allegedly, because it's not true that these were amendments that were supposed to be against equality. They were not supposed, despite the fact that they were aimed at, but they were not supposed and not formulated as amendments against the Arabs. And it creates, I think, a very important distinction we were discussing all this session. The idea was that you cannot identify publicly with a state that goes to war with your country of citizenship. Now, it's true that under the circumstances of Israel, this usually will apply to Arabs. But this is not necessarily so. And I think the principle of wanting to say that a person who chooses to publicly identify with people who have an armed conflict with one's country are not eligible not to speak, not to associate, not to live in the country, not to enjoy benefits, but to run to parliament, I don't think this is necessarily an undemocratic legislation, not to mention that it would be unconstitutional if parliament, after debate and after a lot of public debate, there is a tendency in Israel in recent time to raise balloons of very unpleasant legislation, very unpleasant legislation. I think one of the nice things about Israel is that public debate in Israel and the political dynamism in Israel usually mean that these laws, these bills, are not made into laws. You have a very, very robust public debate in this country, and I don't think that on the books at present, we have a law that I think is clearly unconstitutional. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Michael, next.
Because going out the other way around does not...
Yeah, you're always in the middle.
I'm always in the middle, yeah.
I think that there's something to this metaphor that is true.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. The questions were really very challenging, and I'll try to answer some of them at least. Now, be conscious about how 1948, 1947 is very much present, but 1967 is very much absent from all of this discussion on Jewish and democratic state. Now, in 1967, Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. With no political rights there, it was military government. There's no freedom of expression there. There's no freedom of association. And this lasted not for a year or two. This lasted for decades, and it's still lasting in certain places which are still under Israeli control. And take cognizance of the following fact as well. Israel has initiated a settlement project in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So banishing the green line, saying it does not exist and we exist, the Jewish collectivity in the West Bank, we'll build cities and move civilians and live there, that's okay. But if you as Arabs would do the other thing around, that's unconstitutional, okay? If an Arab party would come and say, okay, let's take the West Bank and Israel and conceive them as one unit, that's unconstitutional. But if you're a Jewish party and you say, Eretz Yisrael Shlima, all the land of Israel is one unit, you're not only legitimized, but you can become a prime minister. You can become a foreign minister. That's okay. That's constitutional. But if I, as an Arab, would come and say the same thing, let's have this as one constitutional unit, that's unconstitutional. I think that's very problematic. That's very problematic. And that's why I say the burden is not on me. The burden is not on me if I want equality. The burden is on the side that is against complete equality. You cannot just disregard 1967. You cannot act in the West Bank and Gaza Strip as part of Israel and then say, okay, now let's change everything. So if in 1947 the Arab collectivity did not accept the two-state solution, and it should bear the consequences, why also not make it the same for Israel when it goes into the West Bank and has it as one unit and not bear the consequences? Why should only one side bear the consequences? This is something which I cannot conceive. Now, the issue of collective rights and individual rights. This is a very delicate matter. And true, in certain places you cannot differentiate, but there is this millet system. There are 13 different non-Jewish recognized religious communities inside of Israel. You have 10 different Christian communities that are recognized. You have the Muslim community, the Druze community, and the Baha'is. It's a small community, but it is also recognized. You have 13 different non-Jewish religious communities. And meaning that they are recognized is that they can establish their own court system and apply their own religious law exclusively, at least in terms of marriage and divorce. And they will have what we call concurrent jurisdiction in certain, not all, certain other personal status matters. That is dependent on whether the sides or the parties would agree to such a jurisdiction. Now that could be perceived as very liberal, very tolerant. I can also conceive that as also very problematic. And this is where some of my writings concentrates on. Being a liberal Christian, a secular Christian, this kind of a system would infringe on my personal rights because I don't want this rule of religious rules. And being also an Arab, I'm less willing to challenge it. Now speaking of the Arab collectivity, because that would kind of weaken my national struggle as one unit. So if I would start raising the religious issue, that would weaken me nationally. So I'm more entrapped within my religious community, and my liberal rights as an individual, secular individual, are more infringed upon than relatively my Jewish co-citizen. So this thing about individual rights and collective rights, it's very complicated, and it can work both ways. Things that could be perceived as tolerant, as liberal, if you can look at it from another angle, the same thing would be conceived or characterized as illiberal. Actually, Will Kimlicka speaks about the millet system as an example of an illiberal toleration, system of toleration. He has a very two models of tolerations, he calls them. And the liberal and the illiberal, and the millet system is the example of an illiberal kind of a system of toleration. This is what I have in mind to say in comments to the questions. Democracy, I think my colleagues have spoken about it. It has a lot of meanings. I mean, we've been speaking about democracy without defining the term, and that could be a reason why we have some of the inquiries. Actually, two scholars here at the Hebrew University, Avishai Margalit and Moshe Halbertal, wrote a very convincing article. They said, in Israel, in terms of liberal multiculturalism, the Jewish majority does not need much protection because it's a majority. And because of its status as a majority, it can work to guarantee its own needs as a majority. The group that needs the protection is actually the minority. But here as well, things need to be also looked about in perspective. Because that's true, the Arab minority does not want to assimilate into the Jewish majority. Now, when Kimlicka and other people speak about multiculturalism, that is legitimized because the minorities need not assimilate. But nobody here is trying to assimilate anybody. On the contrary, the Jewish majority, by history and by tradition, seeks to preserve its own collectivity. So what's the reason for collective rights nonetheless. I think the reason for collective rights, and this is my hope, and this is I think the need why this is why we need to think differently, is the question of what should we have as a democracy? A democracy which is more exclusive, or one which is more inclusive? And this is the real challenge. What is offered for Israel as a democracy to be more exclusive? All of what I'm seeing is that it's becoming more and more exclusive. Jewish and democratic as a definition. It appears in the law of freedom of occupation. Why? Why is it necessary to have this definition in the law of freedom of occupation? Why can't we have one document which is constitutional, a Bill of Rights which is neutral? Why can't we have one document, the law of human dignity and freedom and human dignity? Why should we have our collective definition everywhere? It's becoming some kind of a genetic code that it needs to be everywhere. Why? Is that necessary? I think not.
Thank you. Claude? First speaker, last speaker, see the symmetry. First speaker yesterday, for those of you who can remember.
Well, there's a lot of things I have to choose. Martin, I answer you. Your question reminds me of a question by my students when they say, well, what is worse? If they want to make a revolution, they'll do a revolution. So what does it mean to have non-amendable provisions? Okay, that is true. That is true. But first, let me draw your attention to the following. When we say Jewish and democratic, we say also democratic. And we need the protection of the democratic state. We, in Israel, have attacks, internal attacks against the democratic character of the state, not from the Arab part, but from some sectors of our own population who do not accept the democratic character. And we need that protection. And, well, we have now talked for a few hours, and we have talked for a few decades about the problems with the Arabs, but we tend to forget that we have that problem also, which is extremely important, and that we need the Supreme Court basing its intervention against those attacks on what we called yesterday, according, I think, to the Indian experience, the basic structure of, well, not constitution, but our regime. That's important. We don't have only that problem, we have also the problem of democracy, and we have to defend it. Now, I am not sure whether we need to transform it in amendable or not amendable, in non-amendable. It won't help a lot. We have the protection already of the Supreme Court, and in any way, if they want to overthrow the regime, and if there will be a large Arab majority, so we will stop talking about it. But there is a certain period in the meantime where there is possibility of intervention in terms of democracy, we see, and also in terms of the ethnic identity of that state. No more than that, of course. We cannot accept much more than that. Well, to answer specifically regarding conversion, I am not a specialist on conversion. What is true, that must be said to those who don't really are familiar with, and it's not my field of expertise, but Judaism has ceased to be a proselyte religion maybe 1,500 years ago. But you can still convert to Judaism. Okay, it's not very easy. It's not very easy, especially in the Orthodox world, because you have to accept all the rules of the Orthodox of our religion, of the Orthodox version of the religion. It's not easy. Well, let me say, well, just to give an indication, we say there are 613 commandments in the Torah. Okay, so you have to observe also 613. So why do you need that? Okay, are you really willing to accept it, will the rabbi, an Orthodox rabbi, ask. So it's very, very complicated. It's told that when a person comes to an Orthodox rabbi and says, I want to convert, he should try to explain to him, you don't have to convert. Be a good man and you don't have to convert. If he insists so, he will start the procedure, etc. Then we have, of course, something else, which is non-Orthodox conversion, because there are liberal and conservative movements in Judaism, mainly outside of Israel, also here, but mainly outside. Technically, it's recognized here for the purpose of the law of return. It will not be recognized by the rabbis if you want to marry after that, but you can obtain Israeli citizenship if you have converted by a Reform rabbi abroad. It's not easy. I agree with you. It's not very easy. Okay, regarding political parties, Rainer, I was very much impressed. I remember that problem of the threshold to enter. Well, 5%. Well, if we will have 5% threshold, we'll have only 3 parties, maybe only 2. So I don't know. Maybe we should do it, but probably we cannot do it. And it's interesting because we have a proportional system, but one proportional system, the entire country is just one constituency, okay, which returns 120 MKs. This is also because we are a society which is not homogeneous. So we have to give representation to all the groups. On the other side, having that system, it is an encouragement for the group, for the leaders of the group, not to allow more integration. So we have really that problem. Okay, that's mainly all. I must answer something to Michael, to Michael. Well, it's not very easy. You talk about freedom of expression in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. Well, I don't know if we have a good case here. I don't know whether you have a good case. There is no freedom of expression in the Gaza Strip. It's not because of us.
No.
No, it's not. Okay. And in the West Bank, well, I don't know. I mean, probably during the occupation period, the real occupation from 1967, there has been probably more freedom of expression as before as even now. I'm not sure about it. Only with political respect, I mean to the resistance, what is called. That's a very, very uneasy problem. Now, what you said also, well, it was a nice image you brought. Okay, where the Eretz Israel Hashlema, the complete Eretz Israel, if you or an Arab party is in favor of it, and if a Jewish party is in favor of it. First of all, the large parties, I mean the Likud and even the other from Lieberman, they don't speak anymore of Eretz Israel Hashlema. It has disappeared practically. It's only very, very, very small parties. Now, it has not the same meaning, of course, as it has if an Arab party says, well, we want the entire Palestine, I mean, historical Palestine, etc. So it is very strange, of course, it is very strange, and I think a party probably would be banned if he would say, well, we would like to replace Israel, the state of Israel, by a united Palestine. But then it has a completely different meaning than the other one. I would say that both, the Jewish Israeli version and the second one, are completely unrealistic in my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so now the time has come to close this day and a half of wonderful discussion. And I want to thank, above all, Claude Klein and the Hebrew University and his entire team. I mean, many of us dealt with Ahuva Ezra, who was very helpful, and then maybe many others that I don't know. I had a wonderful time. The entire, not only the intellectual, conceptual challenges, which were many, and I think, like all good conferences, leave us with more questions than answers, and that's always good, because in our profession we want to plan future conferences, and I at least have a few ideas. I'm sure around the room there are many more. And I understand that that's the end of the whole thing. So I would like to give a hand and have you join me, give a hand to Claude for his wonderful organization. And now taking off his hat as an organizer to all three panelists, they were all superb and expressed the views that they wanted in a magnificent way and had a wonderful discussion, also a very civil discussion on a very difficult topic. Thank you, all three of you.